Welcome to the Daily Freedomist Show. This is your host, Paul Gordon Collier, coming at you live on the Gold, Black and Gold Freedomist YouTube channel. Also coming at you live from Freedomist.com, where today we are going to talk about FBI calls attempted murder of politicians terrorism, Harry hates American freedom, and more Chinese agents found in American schools. And the name of this episode is going to be Targeting Republicans for Assassination is Terrorism After All. You can see the little thumbnail here, which I'm going to use for this video as well. We've got the DNC Gov Purge claims Space Force Commander. Space Force Commander went bye-byes. And that is the story that we're going to start off with. So let's get that queued up here and go. FBI admits attempted murder of Republican senators in 2017 was actually, bear with me folks, bear with me, an act of terrorism. And I'm showing here a picture of Steve Scalise, who was shot and almost died and spent months in the hospital recovering, and I think he still has major physical impediments from when he was shot by a DNC-inspired gunman who opened fire on Republicans while they were playing a game of baseball, because all of the DNC mass media have been telling this person that Republicans are basically subhumans, and you shouldn't really engage with them the way that you do human beings in any civil sense of the term. That's the backdrop that we have here. Now that Americans are distracted fully from the events of 2017, when a DNC-inspired terrorist sought to make politics using murder by killing Republican politicians, well, the FBI has released a report that admitted what the DNC-controlled agitprop organs avoided all these years to protect the narrative that the DNC is angelic and all other demonic and unredeemable, expendable, if you will. I believe Hillary used the word basket of deplorables, really, and that came, by the way, no, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that did come. Oh, yeah, this is 2017. Yeah. That came before this. So that came in the election of 2016, where Hillary Clinton decided to subhumanize half of the country. And the DNC said, yeah, that seems like a good strategy. Let's go with that. And you only go with that strategy if you really believe that you are the fundamental power in the land. When you are the perceived weakness in the land, you don't do such things. You only do such things when you perceive that you're the fundamental power of the land. And I'm getting this from Legal Insurrection. FBI quietly admits 2017 GOP ballgame attack by leftists was domestic terrorism. And let's go check out the Legal Insurrection article here. This is from Mike LaChance. An individual with a personalized violent ideology targeted and shot Republican members of Congress at a baseball field and wounded 5 people. Last month, it was revealed that the shooting of Steve Scalise and the targeting of other Republicans at a baseball field in 2017 had been classified by the FBI as a case of suicide by cop. Oh, so this wasn't a political terrorist type thing, because then you would have to, the DNC couldn't put. I am not going to tell you that the right, whatever you want to call the right, the self-identifying right, is not actually guilty of doing things that could incite people to violence and whatnot. But the DNC is more than guilty of the same, and actually the DNC is more guilty, not so much because they're more wicked than the quote-unquote right, but because they have significantly more power and influence in the land. They are the party of the majority power. And as such, they have far more responsibility for the words that they say, because they affect far more human beings. And when they demonize you, people die for sure. Where there's the RNC, whatever, if they demonize people, people might die. But the DNC almost assured when they demonize people, people die. Whether they die with a bullet in the head or whether they die with the market assassinations that the corporate state nationalists are willing to carry out when the DNC gives them the marching orders to do so. Now, the relationship of the DNC and the corporate state nationalists, that's more complicated than I care to get into right now, but let's just say that there is a useful alliance between the two, but they're not necessarily the same thing, and as consolidations of power continue, you can affect some friction between the two as you have various individuals within those factional alignments that will utilize their advantage such as they can to try to seize absolute power. And that's what we're seeing happening right here. So we have here, the shooter was a Bernie Sanders supporter and Rachel Maddow superfan who went to the baseball field with a list of Republicans, meaning this was most certainly a politically motivated shooting. The fact that AG Merrick Garland is calling the Trump supporters who riot in the Capitol white supremacists and the greatest threat to our democracy, while the FBI glosses over the politics of a shooter who clearly intended to kill Republicans, shows just how unbalanced our yeah, sure, why not? This week, how unbalanced our justice system has become. This week, Scalise and other members of Congress sent a letter to the FBI demanding this issue be addressed. Just sent this letter to the FBI, Steve Scalise, classifying the congressional baseball attack by a leftist gunman with a hit list of Republicans as suicide by cop is offensive and inaccurate. Those of us who were actually shot at demand a review of how that absurd conclusion was reached. And we have Representative Brad Wenstrup saying, my letter with Steve Scalise joining in. And this week, while the media obsessed about Liz Cheney every day, the FBI quietly reclassified the shooting. FBI quietly admits 2017 baseball shooting was domestic terrorism after all. And so there you go. Now that nobody's not watching, nobody's paying attention, and they got all this little stuff going on, now they're just going to quietly admit when people might have been paying attention, they soft-pedaled it so as to not damage the party, because the government, the United States government, such as that is, and the Democrat National Committee are one. We are following the Chinese model, where there's no distinguishing between the party, the political party, and the Chinese Communist Party in the case of China, and here it's the DNC. They're one and the same in terms of how they're formulating and justifying their reality of power to we the poors, and the government. The government and the party are one, which means the people in the party are one, which means that if you're outside of the party, you're outside of all orthodoxy that will allow you to make money or live in a land dominated by one party that is also the state, that is also in point of fact, although it's kind of messy, it's not as clean, but still, we'll say for right now at least, as well as the authoritarian marketplace as well. All right, let's get to our next story. Move on down here. Here we go. And I want to let you guys know that the stories that I pick here are basically the most popular stories that I release in the morning, and then the ones that are most popular are the ones that I'm going to talk about in the afternoon. So here is the second most popular story. We started with the first most popular story. So the audience on our website here on Freedomist.com determines what this show is going to cover. So let's get to our next story. Prince Harry calls American free speech laws and the Bill of Rights bonkers. Bonkers, that's right. He calls it bonkers. And there you see the face of Prince Harry, and this is probably taken before he met his, whatever her name is, Meghan Markle, whatever her name is. And this is one of the last times that there was maybe some authentic joy on this man's face, because you never see authentic joy on this man's face anymore. So this must have been before he got totally taken in, or chose to, however it happened, where he got taken into this ideology of fear, hate, and human diminishment, so that the few can continue to control the many by any means necessary. The difference between growing up in a land in which the king is a piece of paper with words on it versus a king who takes up flesh form, well, Just look at how one man who grew up in the land of the kings of flesh, who himself was once a possible future heir of such kingship, as he reacts to the concept of a king of paper that cannot die, that has no charisma, no existential perpetuation, but depends that he depends on for his power. So you can't murder King Bill like you can a human being. You can't Me Too King Bill like you can a human being. You can't demonize, ostracize King Bill. You can't murder King Bill in the marketplace. You have to murder the followers of King Bill. And to do so, you have to violate King Bill to do it. And that's what the DNC is working on. And that's what Prince Harry wants to see happen, because he's bought into this wokeitarian nonsense that somehow whites and heterosexuals and males in some weird cabal invented evil. And if we could just terminate whites, males, and heterosexuals, literally and or figuratively or otherwise, then we will bring heaven on earth and evil will end and everything will be great. Now, all we got to do, though, is kill the undesirables before we can get to that. So he's on board with that. So for him, it would seem natural that he would be so offended by an idea of a king that cannot be murdered. This is the biggest challenge that Christianity, when it is authentically followed, the biggest challenge that Christianity presents to authoritarianism in general. It's an ideology. Christianity, if you want to call it an ideology, it's an ideology that refuses to bend to the prospect of death. And when you're no longer afraid of death, you're a very dangerous person when you have authoritarian ideologues about it. So, Prince Harry, he is the one-time potential future king of England, can't fathom the Bill of Rights, especially the idea of free speech, the concept alone being a governor over the many, including the very rulers in the flesh of the land. They can't comprehend that flesh rulers would be limited by something outside of themselves, something that they can't murder or cancel. And this is from page6.com. Prince Harry is taking heat for calling the First Amendment bonkers in a recent podcast. Oh, he's only taking heat from a small set in America, unfortunately, mostly from human beings belonging to a faction that at one point was more than willing to champion anti-Bill of Rights sentiments when they perceived that they were more in power, but now that they're not, now they're back on our side, on we the poor side, in which they're actually going to be champions of the Bill of Rights because now they need them. And hey, I welcome their alliance, so to speak, but I hope maybe they can come to terms with maybe practicing a Bill of Rights standard that applies to all in all circumstances, including the marketplace, including the public square, and especially including in governments defined and controlled public squares, but not just them, all public squares. So continuing here, let's see, from page 6. So the Duke of Sussex made the statement on Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert podcast while discussing what he called the media feeding frenzy that arose from his stay at Tyler Perry's Beverly Hills mansion, the Daily Mail reported. I've got so much I want to say about the First Amendment as I sort of understand it, but it is bonkers. I don't want to start going down the First Amendment route because that's a huge subject, and the one which I don't understand because I've only been here for a short time. Like the Bill of Rights standards come from English traditions. England never really fully formed an actual paper king, but they set the precedent for a paper king. So the fact that someone who was once in line to potentially be, if things went a certain way, could have been the next king of England, the fact that that person doesn't understand the Bill of Rights tells you all you need to know about the royal family and how out of touch they are with the rest of humanity. Because I can tell you, average rank and file English, they understand the Bill of Rights. Most human beings, most poors around the world understand the Bill of Rights, and they wish they had them. And I bet you most poors, if and when the DNC succeeds in fully finishing off the one true king in the land, the Bill of Rights, King Bill, I imagine many people around the world that are frothing at the bit to see America's demise will rue the day that they did. Now, an America ruled by the DNC is basically just like a Chinese Communist Party type situation. So they will no longer be a beacon of freedom for the rest of the world, because they don't offer freedom for the rest of the world, or even for themselves, let alone the rest of the world. But assuming somehow we, the poors, who understand rightly that the Bill of Rights is our only hope for fending off the authoritarian collectivist powers of the few over the many, then we will once again have a beacon of light for the rest of the world in a land where King Bill reigns. And hopefully, if and when we get back power, we will more consistently follow the Bill of Rights and not treat other people outside of our lands as if they too don't deserve to be treated like they have bills of rights as well, whether they're citizens or not. And that's another story altogether. But there you have it. Prince Harry just doesn't fundamentally understand. That's our last story. That's all we're going to do. We're just going to do 3 stories on this show from now on. Not 6, but 3. So let's do our last story. Ohio State professor exposed as Chinese operative faces jail time after conviction. So if you don't think that the Chinese fascistic state has not thoroughly infiltrated American institutions, not so coincidentally, ones controlled by the party, the DNC, like academia, and the DNC are one. Academia marches lockstep with the DNC, I can assure you. And they will enforce DNC orthodoxy on everyone, and they have multiple firings and even college kids that have lost their, well, basically, but they pay for college and then they're kicked out of college, and that is done when you fail to meet the DNC orthodoxy. So the academia and the party are one. It's very, very Chinese Communist Party kind of centered, so it makes sense that they'd be harmonized with the Chinese because they're using their model. They're not exactly, by the way, I want to make it clear, they're not communists, they're not Marxists, they're something else, but neither are the Chinese. Whatever words they want to use, they're something else. And I don't exactly know that we have a word to describe what it is that the Chinese are and the DNC Americans are, if you want to call them Americans. I think it's an abomination to call the DNC Americans. But they're something sort of fascistic, sort of communistic, but not really. They have more in common, I would say, with puritanicalism on the whole, because they use largely a very, very specifically defined code of moral supremacisms to browbeat humanity into submission. So they're a little bit different, but still, on the main, China and the DNC, they're using the same patterns, and I'm not sure who learned who from what. I think the DNC mostly learned from the Chinese. Anyway, from the Washington Examiner, Ohio State professor jailed for 3 years for lying about Chinese funding. And I'm going to go to the article here. We'll go a little bit deeper into this here. And this is from Washington Examiner, as I said it. I think I said that. If I didn't, I just did. A former professor at the Ohio State University who had pleaded guilty to making false statements. Gee, Zooey. How many pop-ups do you want to give me, Washington Examiner? All right, calm down, son. Slow your roll. A former professor at the Ohio State University who had pleaded guilty to making false statements to federal authorities related to concealing his financial ties to China while receiving funding from the National Institutes of Health was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison on Friday and was ordered to pay millions in restitutions. Song Gu-Zheng, formerly a leading immunologist and rheumatologist at the Ohio State University and Penn State University, oh man, that's my sort of alma mater. I've taken more than a few classes there, so sort of my alma mater. Received 37 months behind bars at Penn State, by the way, not Ohio State. Well, you know what? Look at this. Ohio State, Penn State, if you're into college sports at all, I used to be. I'm not into sports anymore for reasons. I think most of you could probably figure out what the reasons are. But when I was, Penn State and Ohio State, I mean, that's fire and vinegar right there, man. You don't mix them two. So right away, this guy was in trouble. How do you go from Ohio State to Penn State or back and forth? No. That's not right. Anyway, so he received 37 months behind bars, and the judge also ordered Zheng to pay more than $3.4 million to the NIH and roughly $413,000 to the Ohio State University. Zheng was arrested in July 2020 while apparently trying to flee to China after he illegally received more than $4 million in grants from NIH while he concealed his affiliation with China's talents plan at Sun Yat-sen University, and he pleaded guilty in November 2020 to lying to investigators about what prosecutors called an immunology research fraud scheme. In yet another case involving the Chinese government's Thousand Talents program, Songgyu Zheng will spend the next 37 months at a federal prison because he chose to lie and hide his involvement in this program from U.S. research funding agencies. John DeMars, the Assistant Attorney General for the Justice Department's National Security Division, said Friday. And there's not much more to say about that. This is going to be a short little segment here because I think that speaks for itself. So, yeah. American academia and the Chinese state, well, they get along. They get along really well. And it's not a surprise that he was prosecuted before the DNC took power. I'll just say that. Although, to be sure, don't get me wrong, there's a dialecticalism going on here. So the DNC will prosecute and arrest some Chinese spies. And the DNC will do things that'll say, no, see, they're against China. See that? What are you talking about? They're not aligned with China. Well, the DNC and the Chinese are both, they both fundamentally believe that they hold the keys to a finite code of human property, and they have a right, nay, a duty, to destroy any dissenters that get in the way of them creating their heaven on earth. And so they both view the other as maybe a useful ally, but in the end, neither one wants to see the other standing. So they will work against each other while they're also working with each other. And that actual reality is very, very, very much the fashion of the day around the world, with multiple factions, whether they're nation states or otherwise, that find themselves in one sphere working with someone and in another sphere working against someone. It's a tangled mess out there, and yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. So some of the stories that we are going to have behind a paywall, we haven't fully set this paywall model up yet, but we are going to be developing a paywall that has special content. So the special content we're going to get a lot more analytical and in-depth with, and cover stories that aren't necessarily, like for this show, we're basically trying to cover the stories that we can get some traction on, so mainstream type stories. And when we deal with our stuff behind the paywall, not that we won't cover mainstream stories, like here you see this first thing up here about the Israel-Gaza conflict, we will, but we'll be covering a lot of stories that aren't necessarily going to get us a lot of clicks. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to create the paywall. Try to create a monetization model that allows us to create content for people who aren't always just looking for mainstream content. Mainstream dealing with trending topics, whatever, which is, if you're not doing trending topics, you're not building news these days. So you kind of have to. So with that in mind, here's some of the stories that we're going to be talking about behind the paywall. Maybe today. Israel-Gaza conflict, reality, depends on the factional lens you look through. And this is an intelligence report that you can click on this and get access to the full intelligence report right now. Eventually it will be behind a paywall, though. So you'll see the paragraph here. We're working on getting stuff set up still. So the Israeli-Gaza conflict is complex, with little pure angels or pure demons on either side of the divide, save at the top of both prevailing authorities in the land, the State of Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority. As could be predicted, the right, the quote-unquote right, which there's no such thing as right or left, it's whatever. Well, not by my reckoning, but we'll just say the right because they identify as the right. The right, which sees Israel almost as a religious obligation for the United States to protect, only sees the Palestinians as the villains, while offering little to no critique of how Israel has conducted itself, and it's not been an angel. I'll just say. Meanwhile, the left looks at everything Israel does as literally being worse than Hitler. Yes, the irony is lost on the unthinking adherents of the DNC party orthodoxy, while refusing to even question the tactics of targeting civilians for murder, as Hamas has demonstrated it's willing to do over and over again. Not very social justice minded, the Hamas is. Not very. But still, the DNC finds comfort in Hamas. Yeah. The wokatarian thing is a lie. They don't care about any of that morality. Nobody cares about saving anyone. I can assure you. It's all just pure self-serving power. Cyclone of the century threatens millions of Indian lives and stability. A major cyclone is beating down in India called Cyclone. Sorry, I spelled that wrong again. Keep switching those words around. I got a mild case of kind of the dyslexia, not full-on dyslexia, but certain things I do switch around all the time. So, a major cyclone. See, I didn't even put the C in there. I totally butchered this word, cyclone. Is bearing down on India called Cyclone Tauktae that has already claimed scores of lives and caused millions of dollars of damage. And we're going to be tracking this and keeping you up to date with it as it goes along, because this is going to keep on going through the next week. And then finally, China looks to fill power vacuum in Afghanistan after America limps home in defeat. America's top rival, China, is pouncing on the appearance of weakness by the U.S. in their manner of withdrawal from Afghanistan to undermine American reputational power abroad, while seeking Chinese reputational power increases in the region. And yeah, when you get to the intelligence reports, you'll see a bunch of links, and then there's more commentary in between the links. So they're somewhat pretty they're pretty extensive intelligence analysis reports. Where I'm analyzing the news as well as how the news is being caught. And that's it, folks. That's the end of the show. I thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow at about the same time. It'll be between, right now, because of how I have to do things, I have to change the time to noon. Between noon and 12:30 p.m. is when we're going to do the show. So thank you all who have